The first sign that the house could make its own decisions came from a place nobody expects. The water meter showed steady usage on a day when the new owner hadn't even moved a bed inside yet. It was 2002 in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and the house sat quiet behind a line of trees like it had been waiting for a person who didn't ask questions. He stood in the yard with a clipboard, trying to convince himself it was a leaky toilet or an old pipe, while someone inside the structure listened and stayed still. By late afternoon, a friend had found trim that didn't sit right, a wall that sounded hollow, and a seam that looked too straight to be accidental. The friend said there was a door built to look like nothing, and then the basement light died in the same second the front exit stopped opening. The new owner ran room to room with his phone in his hand, pulling on a knob that turned without releasing, while the house stayed calm around him, as if it approved. A man moved through the hidden spaces behind the walls without showing his face. He had already used the neighborhood's ghost stories to keep people from looking too close, and he had already taken people connected to the address. When the friend stopped answering and the new owner fled to the neighbor's porch to call 911, the man walked out the back like an employee ending a shift, carrying a duffel bag that mattered more than any furniture. Hours later, police pulled wallets from the house that belonged to missing people, and they found a ground hatch behind an old shed that led to the alley. The camera the new owner had set up kept recording, and it captured one last moment that made his stomach drop because it showed the intruder standing in the hallway like he owned the place, close enough to look straight into the lens. Let me walk you through what really happened that day. At the time, I was 29. I'd just bought my first house. I told myself the deal proved I'd finally gotten ahead, but the truth was simpler. I was tired of paying rent, tired of living in a place where I could hear a neighbor's television through the wall, and tired of feeling like I was one paycheck away from falling behind. I installed appliances for a living, and I spent my weekdays watching other people live in houses that already felt safe. When the county sale listing showed up with a low price and a clean-looking exterior photo, I treated it like a chance I couldn't afford to miss. I drove to Guthrie early that morning with a coffee I didn't taste and a folder of paperwork on my passenger seat. The sale was in a plain building with fluorescent lights and a counter window. A few people stood around in work boots, talking quietly like they'd been doing this for years. I didn't know anyone, which should have been my first clue. The people who belong at those sales recognize faces, and the outsiders stand out, especially the ones who look eager. A clerk slid my receipt under the glass, then slid a key ring after it. She didn't smile. She just said, "Make sure you secure it right away," like she was talking about a tool shed full of lawn equipment. I asked if there was a reason, trying to sound casual. She looked at me for half a second, then glanced down at the paperwork. "Older property," she said. "Things get complicated." That was all she offered, and I didn't push because I wanted to keep the moment normal. Guthrie looked the way it always does from the road, a mix of old brick storefronts and neighborhoods where houses still had porches you could sit on. The house I bought sat a few blocks from a main street, but the lot ran deep, and the trees made it feel more tucked away than it should have. When I pulled up, I saw peeling paint and an overgrown side yard, but nothing that screamed danger. It just looked neglected, the way a lot of older houses look when an owner passes and nobody has the energy to keep up. I carried my first box onto the porch and noticed the front door hardware right away. The knob felt loose in a way that didn't match the age, as if someone had adjusted it recently. The deadbolt turned, but the motion didn't feel clean. It caught slightly, then slid free. I told myself I'd replace everything that afternoon. I even said it out loud, first thing, like that made it happen sooner. Inside, the air felt warmer than outside, and not in a comforting way. It was late morning, the sun was up, and the house held heat like it didn't want to let it go. I walked room to room doing what I always do in a new place, building a map in my head. Living room to dining room to kitchen, kitchen to a narrow hall with a basement door, and a stairwell that went up with a slight bend at the landing. The upstairs had 3 small bedrooms and a bathroom with a mirror that looked too new for the rest of the fixtures. I unloaded for an hour, stacking boxes in the living room, then started cleaning because cleaning makes a place feel controlled. I swept the downstairs first, then the upstairs, and I remember doing it because the dust came off the baseboards in gray curls, like it had been waiting for someone to disturb it. I opened windows for airflow and propped a back door for a few trips, then shut it again because a neighbor's warning echoed in my head, even though I hadn't met her yet. Around noon, I heard a car door close outside. I walked to the front window and saw an older woman in her driveway holding a watering can, looking toward my porch with a steady, assessing stare. She wasn't curious in a friendly way. She looked like she was measuring risk. I stepped onto the porch and raised a hand. "Hi." She set the watering can down and walked closer at a calm pace. "You're the new owner," she said. "Yeah," I replied. "Just moved in." She didn't offer her hand. "Linda Rusk," she said. "Next door." "I'm Evan," I said, and gave her the kind of quick smile you use with neighbors you want to stay on good terms with. Linda looked past me into my hallway, then back at my face. "Are you here alone?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. I tried to make it sound ordinary. "Just me for now." Her mouth tightened. "Change your locks today," she said. "That's already the plan," I told her. She nodded once, then leaned in slightly like she was about to share something she didn't want the whole street to hear. "If a man comes by in a tan work shirt and says he's checking utilities or writing up repairs, you don't have to be polite," she said. I felt my smile fade. "A contractor?" "No," she said immediately. "Not a contractor. What does he do?" "He asks questions that don't match his story," she replied. "Who lives here? If you live alone? What time you leave? What time you get back?" And he'll say it like it's harmless. I glanced down the street without meaning to. "Have you seen him around this house?" "I've seen him close to it," Linda said. "More than once, usually when it's empty." "Why didn't anyone—" I started, then stopped because I didn't know what I was asking. Why didn't anyone call? Why didn't anyone run him off? Why didn't someone warn me earlier? The questions felt childish as soon as they formed. Linda answered anyway, in her own way. "People talk," she said, "and people decide they don't want trouble. This house already has stories attached to it, and stories make real things easier to ignore." That word landed wrong. Stories. I didn't ask what she meant, but she continued. "3 people connected to this address have gone missing in the last year and a half," she said. "Not all at once, spread out, enough that the flyers faded and the talk moved on." I swallowed. Missing like they moved? Linda's eyes stayed on mine. "Missing like families put up posters and kept calling," she said. "Missing like the police took reports and didn't find anything that made sense." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Did the police ever check the house?" "They checked what they could check," Linda replied. "But if you don't know what you're looking for, you don't find it." She lifted her watering can again. "Just change your locks," she repeated, then added, "and stop leaving doors propped, even in daylight." When she walked back to her yard, I stood there longer than I wanted to. I looked at my side yard, the narrow strip that ran toward the back fence. I looked at the alley access behind the property. Nothing moved. Everything looked harmless. That was the problem. If something had looked obviously wrong, I might have acted faster. I went inside and shut the door. I turned the deadbolt and tested it twice. Then I pulled my phone out and checked the time, like time could ground me. It was 12:18 p.m., and I told myself I was being wound up by a neighbor who had lived next to an empty house too long. I started changing the lock hardware. I drove to a hardware store, bought a new deadbolt set and a basic knob, then came back and worked with the front door open only when I had to. I installed everything myself and tested it until my fingers hurt. When I finished, I stood in the hallway and stared at the door like it owed me an apology. Upstairs, I noticed the bathroom mirror again. It looked too new and too clean. I ran a hand along the edge and felt a thin bead of moisture. That didn't make sense because the house was quiet, the windows were open, and nothing had run. I leaned closer, and for a few seconds the center of the mirror fogged faintly, like breath on glass, even though I wasn't close enough for my breath to do it. I stepped back and watched it fade. I didn't tell myself it was paranormal. I told myself the mirror had a temperature difference, that maybe it had been replaced recently and held cold differently than the walls. I told myself it was physics, not a warning. Still, I kept looking at it as I walked away, and I didn't like the feeling that something had happened without my permission. In the upstairs hallway, I noticed the attic access panel. It sat in the ceiling near the bend of the stairs. a simple framed square with hinges that should have creaked when moved. I could see a faint line of dust on its edge, and the dust looked disturbed in one corner, as if the panel had been lifted recently and set back down. I dragged a chair over, stood on it, and pressed my palm against the panel. It didn't feel warm. It didn't vibrate. I lowered it a fraction of an inch and felt it move smoother than it should have. The hinges didn't complain. The panel came down silently. Then I pushed it back up because the idea of opening it alone felt like stepping into a decision I couldn't undo. I stepped off the chair and looked down the hallway. Sunlight came through the window at the landing and laid a clean rectangle on the floor. Dust still floated in that light. I had swept not long before. The dust should have looked disturbed where I had walked. That's when I saw the footprints. 2 prints, narrow and straight, set into the dust where the light hit. They weren't deep, but they were clear. The tread pattern didn't match my sneakers. It looked like a work boot, the kind with a flat, rigid sole. The prints pointed toward the attic access, then angled toward the back bedroom. I stood very still and checked myself in the simplest way. I looked down at my shoes. I looked back at the prints. I pictured my path across the upstairs hall. These were not mine. I went downstairs and checked every lock and window like I was working through a checklist. Front door locked, back door locked, windows shut. I pulled each one. Everything held. That didn't calm me. It narrowed my options into a space I didn't want to explore. Someone had either come in through a way I hadn't found, or someone had already been inside when I opened the door that morning. I pulled my phone out and called Dale Bennett, a friend who did remodeling jobs and never treated anything like a joke once he realized it mattered. Dale answered on the second ring. "What's up?" he said. "I need you to come look at something," I replied. He laughed once. "That's not how you usually start a call." "I'm serious," I said, and I heard my own voice and didn't like how tight it sounded. "I'm at the house. I found prints upstairs that aren't mine, and the attic panel looks like it's been moved." There was a pause, then Dale said, "Are you alone?" "Yes." "Lock yourself in your car," he said. "I don't want to overreact," I replied, even as I knew I had already been underreacting. Dale's voice sharpened. "Evan, if you think someone's in there, you don't go hunting, you leave. Where are you standing right now?" "In the living room," I said. "Go outside," he said. "Now, I'm coming." "I can't just leave my stuff." "Go outside," he repeated. "Text me the address. I'm leaving in 10 minutes. I did what he said. I walked out the front door and stood on the porch, looking down my street like I expected a man in a tan shirt to appear on cue. I texted Dale the address. Then I sat on the porch steps and watched my front door, waiting for it to open from the inside. It didn't. When Dale arrived about an hour later, I felt relief that made my knees weak. He parked, climbed out, and walked up my driveway with a focused expression. He didn't smile. He didn't tease me. He looked at my house like he was reading a problem. "Show me," he said. I took him inside and walked him through what I'd noticed. The mirror, the attic panel, the footprints, Linda's warning, the missing people as she had described them. Dale listened without interrupting, then went upstairs and crouched over the prints like a detective in a small-town movie, except his face didn't have curiosity. It had concern. "These aren't yours," he said. "No," I replied. He stood and looked up at the attic access. "Get me a ladder," he said. I brought the ladder from the garage. Dale set it under the panel and climbed carefully. He lowered the attic door with one hand and aimed a flashlight with the other. He paused in a way that made my stomach tighten. "What?" I asked. Dale angled the beam into the attic space and said, "See that corner?" At first, I saw only old rafters and insulation. Then, I noticed a patch of insulation that looked newer, brighter, and stuffed tighter than the rest, like someone had used it to block airflow. Beside it, a plywood patch sat screwed onto framing in a way that didn't match the age of the surrounding wood. Dale climbed up into the attic far enough to reach the patch. He moved slow and careful, feeling with his hands as he went. Then he backed out and looked down at me. "This isn't animals," he said. "What is it?" I asked. Dale held up a strip of duct tape between his fingers. It was fresh and clean, not cracked, with a dark hair stuck to it. "Someone's been working up here," he said. "Recent." My throat went dry. "Working on what?" Dale climbed down and stepped into the hall. "We find how they move," he said. "If someone's using a house, they don't climb in and out through a window every time. They create a path, and if your neighbor is right about a guy sniffing around empty houses, then you have a bigger problem than bad wiring." We went downstairs. Dale checked details the way he always did. He looked at the bottoms of door frames. He checked vents. He opened the pantry and looked behind shelves. He ran his hand along the kitchen wall as if he expected to feel a seam. He didn't find anything there, but he didn't relax. He stopped at the basement door and stared at it for a moment. "You been down there much?" he asked. "Just to check the water heater," I said. "It's unfinished." Dale put a hand on the knob, then pointed with the other hand at the edge of the door near the latch. "That paint rub," he said. "It's from frequent opening, not old. New wear over old paint." "I chipped paint off the door when I moved in," I said, trying to defend the idea that everything could still be normal. "This isn't from chipping," Dale replied. "This is from use." He opened the basement door, and we went down together. The basement was low and plain, concrete floor, a few old shelves, and a weak bulb that made the corners look darker than they should. Dale walked straight to the far wall like he already knew where he was going. He crouched and ran his fingers along a seam where trim met a section of wall that looked slightly too smooth. "This section is newer," he said. "It all looks old to me," I replied. Dale tapped the wall in 3 places with his knuckles. The sound changed at the center, going from solid to hollow. "Hollow," he said. I felt cold spread through my chest. "So there's space behind it." Dale stood and looked at me. "Do you have a crowbar?" he asked. "In my toolbox," I said. "Bring it," he replied, and then he added, "Keep your phone in your pocket. If something goes wrong, you don't want it on a shelf upstairs." I went up, grabbed the crowbar, and came back down. Dale had his flashlight aimed at the seam like he was waiting for it to move. I handed him the crowbar and watched his hands. He wedged it under a strip of trim and pried once. The trim came loose too easily. Behind it, I saw clean wood, newer studs, and a narrow vertical gap. The gap was too straight to be accidental. Dale leaned close and shined his light into it. His face changed in a quiet way. Not panic, not surprise, but certainty. "There's a door," he said. I wanted to argue, but my eyes told me it was true. The framing had edges. The seam followed a line. It wasn't a crack, it was a boundary. Dale kept his voice low. "We call the police," he said. "Yes," I replied immediately. Dale raised a hand, stopping me. "No," he said. "You call from outside, from your car, or from Linda's porch, right now. I'm not playing around with this." "I'm not leaving you down here," I said. "You're not helping me by staying," Dale replied. He looked back at the seam. "If this door opens and somebody comes out, we don't want you trapped behind me in a basement." I turned toward the stairs. That's when Dale said, "Hey." I stopped and looked back. His head tilted slightly as if he heard something I didn't. His posture tightened. His eyes moved toward the ceiling, then toward the hidden seam. He didn't take his gaze off it. "Get out of the house," Dale said. The basement light went out. Not a flicker, not a slow fade. Out, like someone had flipped a switch with intention. The bulb went dead, and the basement became a different space, a space that felt larger and less safe because I couldn't see the corners anymore. I ran up the stairs, hit the kitchen, and reached for the front door because it was the closest exit. I grabbed the knob, turned it, and pulled. The knob turned. The door didn't open. I tried again, harder. Same result. It felt held in place by something beyond a stuck frame. The deadbolt should have released. It didn't. It felt like a second mechanism had engaged, something deeper than the hardware I had installed. I stepped back and stared, my mind reaching for practical reasons and finding none that fit the timing. I pulled my phone out and called Dale. No answer. I called again and listened to it ring while I stared at the basement door, waiting for Dale to answer with a joke or a curse, anything that proved he was fine. While the phone rang, I heard a dragging sound from below, heavy and controlled, like something being pulled across concrete. I stopped calling and ran to the back door. I turned the knob. It opened. I should have left the house then. I know that now. I should have gone straight outside and stayed outside. But Dale was still inside, and fear doesn't always push you away. Sometimes it pushes you toward the problem because you think you can fix it. I went back to the basement door, opened it, and went down with my phone light aimed ahead of me. "Dale," I called. No answer. Halfway down, I saw his flashlight on the basement floor. The beam still shined, pointed toward the far wall. The hidden seam was wider now, and the door was open, swinging inward into a space that shouldn't have existed. Dale's phone lay on the floor near the flashlight. Dale wasn't there. My pulse hammered so hard my hands felt numb. I forced my voice to stay steady. "Dale, talk to me," I said. From inside the hidden space, I heard a subtle shift, like someone repositioning their weight. I backed up one step without thinking. That's when a hand clamped my shoulder from behind and drove me forward. I hit the concrete hard, palm slamming down. My phone skittered across the floor and the light spun, throwing the basement into moving shadows. For a second, I saw a man's outline close to me, close enough to hear his breathing and feel his presence without seeing his face. A calm voice came near my ear. "Stay down," he said, like he was giving directions at a job site. A boot pressed onto my shin, pinning me. The pressure was precise. It wasn't wild. It was practiced. Something long and rigid pressed lightly against the front of my throat, just enough to make swallowing difficult. "You were supposed to come alone," the voice said. I didn't see his face. I didn't get a clear look at his eyes. What I remember is the certainty in his voice, like he had expected this exact moment. My mind flashed to Linda's warning. The missing people, the way the attic panel moved silently, the way the door hardware felt adjusted. It all snapped into one shape. I reached out blindly with my right hand, feeling concrete, dust, the edge of something cold. My fingers found the crowbar on the floor where Dale had dropped it. I wrapped my hand around the metal and swung backward once, hard, without aiming, just trying to hit anything that made contact. I felt resistance. I heard a grunt. The pressure on my shin released. I didn't stand up clean. I crawled toward the stairs, hauled myself up, and took the steps fast, my hands slipping on the edges. Behind me, I heard movement, but not frantic movement. The man moved with the same controlled pace, like he believed the house would keep him safe. I reached the kitchen and slammed the basement door shut. I leaned my weight into it and listened. The knob turned once from the other side. Then, in the same second, I heard a solid slide of metal, as if a lock engaged that didn't belong on that door. The basement door did not have a deadbolt, and yet something had just secured it. I backed away, staring at the door, understanding with a cold clarity that he could lock it from below whenever he wanted. I ran to the back door and got outside. I didn't stop at my porch. I sprinted across the yard to Linda Rusk's porch, barefoot because I had kicked my shoes off earlier and never put them back on. I pounded on her door with both fists until the skin on my knuckles stung. Linda opened it fast, like she had been listening. Her eyes went to my face, then past me toward my house. "He's in there," she said, not as a question. "Call 911, I said. "He hurt my friend. He locked the basement. He's still inside." Linda grabbed her cordless phone and dialed without hesitation. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice stayed steady, the way it probably stayed steady in classrooms full of loud kids. She gave the address and said there was an intruder in my house and a person injured. While she spoke, I stepped to her front window and watched my back door. It opened. A man stepped out carrying a small duffel bag. He walked like he wasn't afraid of being seen. He didn't rush. He didn't sneak. He moved like a worker leaving a job. He turned his head once and looked straight toward Linda's window, at me. Then he raised one hand and pointed, slow, like he wanted me to know he could find me again if he chose to. He walked off my porch and headed toward the alley behind the houses. I said, "He's leaving." Linda relayed it to the dispatcher, describing his shirt and the duffel bag and his direction. I didn't chase him. I had just felt metal at my throat and a boot on my leg. I had no plan, no backup, and no guarantee he wasn't armed with something worse than what I had felt. Police arrived quickly, faster than I expected. 2 patrol cars first, then a third. Officers moved in pairs, weapons drawn, voices short and controlled. One officer approached Linda's porch, and Linda pointed at me immediately, like she didn't want any confusion about who owned the problem. "I'm Evan Mercer," I said before anyone asked. "He's inside my house, or he was. There's a hidden door in the basement. My friend got dragged through it." The officer's eyes narrowed. Hidden door. Yes, I said. Behind a wall. Another officer stepped closer. Where's the injured person? Basement, I replied. I saw his flashlight and phone on the floor. They moved on my house through the front and back at the same time. I stood on Linda's porch, watching officers disappear through my doors like my house had been taken over by the people I had needed an hour earlier. My breathing stayed shallow. My hands shook without permission. An officer returned from the alley a few minutes later, jogging. We got him, he said. He tried to blend in behind the barber shop. He ditched the duffel behind a dumpster. I didn't see the arrest close up. I saw officers escorting someone in a tan shirt between them. He didn't fight. He didn't thrash. He walked with an unsettling calm. Inside my house, officers called out updates. Found the seam. Door opens inward. Get medical down here. Paramedics arrived and went in with a stretcher. When they carried Dale out, they didn't bring him out walking. His eyes were open, but they didn't focus. There was bruising around his neck, the kind that tells you someone wanted silence. A paramedic held up a hand to keep me back, and I obeyed because I could tell by his tone that seconds mattered. Dale was alive when they loaded him into the ambulance. That fact mattered to me for the next few hours in a way I can't fully explain. It felt like something I could still influence, even though I couldn't. A detective showed up not long after. He wore plain clothes, badge on his belt, and he spoke like a man who had seen too many scenes in too many houses. He introduced himself as Detective Harris and asked me to tell him what happened, start to finish, without leaving anything out. I told him about Linda's warning, the mirror fogging, the attic panel, the footprints, the duct tape, the hollow wall, the light going out, the front door refusing to open, and the man in the basement. I didn't dress it up. I didn't speculate. I kept it sequential because I didn't want to sound like I was trying to sell a story. Detective Harris listened, then asked, You moved in today? Today, I said. He looked at my house with a different expression than the officers had, like he wasn't just seeing a crime scene. He was seeing a pattern. This address has been on our radar, he said carefully. For what? I asked. Missing persons with weak connections, he replied. People who had reasons to be here without anyone expecting them to check in. A cleaner, a renter, a potential buyer. Things that are easy to file as adult choices until families push hard enough that we admit it's not just choices. My chest tightened. So Linda wasn't exaggerating. Detective Harris didn't answer that directly. He said, Stay on the porch. Don't go inside again today. They searched my house for hours. They opened the hidden door fully, and behind it they found a narrow-framed passage that ran behind the kitchen wall and up into a chase that connected to the attic. It wasn't something out of a movie. It was improvised carpentry done well enough to function and hidden behind trim and paint. It used the simplest truth about most homeowners. They don't study their walls. They don't measure voids. They assume what they can't see doesn't exist. They found a small space set up like a camp, a cot, bottled water, packaged food, a portable heater, a police scanner, a binder full of printed listings for houses in the area with notes in the margins written in neat handwriting. Detective Harris brought me inside briefly later, just long enough to identify what wasn't mine. The dining room didn't feel like my dining room. It felt like a workspace for evidence bags and photographs. He placed 3 clear bags on the table. Wallets. Not mine, not Dale's. These belong to 3 people reported missing over the last 18 months, Harris said. My mouth went dry. Are they alive? He paused just long enough to make the answer land. No, he said. I gripped the back of a chair because my legs felt unreliable. Harris watched me with a controlled expression, then said, We're still searching the property. There's more to this than the house. I asked about Dale, and Harris said, He's at the hospital, alive right now. Right now. Those words followed me like a shadow. A few hours later, Linda let me sit on her couch because my house was sealed off and I had nowhere else to go. Around 10:20 p.m., Detective Harris called Linda's phone and asked to speak with me. I knew what it meant before he spoke, because his voice carried the kind of care people use when they have to deliver something permanent. Evan, he said, I'm sorry. Your friend passed away at the hospital. I stared at Linda's family photos on the wall as if they could anchor me. "What happened?" I asked, and my voice sounded far away. Harris kept it straightforward. "Strangulation," he said. "Severe injury." My throat tightened. "So he did that to him in my basement?" "Yes," Harris replied. "And I need you to understand something. If your friend hadn't warned you to get out when the light went out, we might be having a different conversation." I didn't respond right away because my mind kept replaying Dale's voice saying, "Get out of the house," as if he had known what the next second would bring. Over the next day, the rest came out. The man's name was Carl Voss. He had bounced between towns doing temporary jobs, always with a reason that sounded practical. He knew enough carpentry to frame passages. He knew enough about people to choose targets who wouldn't have immediate eyes on them. He had learned that if a house had a reputation for being haunted, neighbors would attribute odd sights and noises to that reputation instead of pushing for real explanations. Behind my shed, investigators found a ground hatch set flush into the soil and hidden under boards and yard debris. The hatch led to a short concrete corridor that ran toward the alley. At the far end, there was a rusted cellar door concealed behind stacked pallets and junk that looked like it belonged. It wasn't a perfect escape route. It was good enough, and good enough is what keeps people from noticing. In the duffel bag Carl tossed behind the dumpster, they found keys. Not just normal keys. Keys with labels. A brass key with a small paper tag tied to it. The tag read, "Front Door" in neat handwriting. I learned later why that mattered. My cheap battery camera had kept recording after I fled. It captured movement in my hallway. It captured the man walking calmly, not rushing, not frantic, like he had time. It captured him stopping close to the lens and looking straight into it with an expression that didn't ask for pity or fear. It looked like ownership. Detective Harris didn't want to show it to me at first. When he did, he didn't play the whole clip. He showed me a still frame printed on plain paper. It was enough. Weeks passed in a blur of statements, calls, and paperwork. I answered questions over and over, and the repetition made me feel detached, like I was talking about someone else's day. The county secured the house and documented every modification. The investigation reached backward into earlier listings and earlier owners, and it reached forward into what Carl had planned next. 6 months later, I signed paperwork and transferred the property to the county. I didn't negotiate. I didn't argue over money. I didn't step back inside. I wanted distance more than I wanted reimbursement. Before the final transfer, Detective Harris asked me to meet him one last time. He said he had something I should see, not because it was required, but because it explained a part that had bothered me since that afternoon. He placed a clear evidence bag on the table. Inside was a small, odd piece of hardware, the kind you wouldn't notice unless someone pointed it out. Then he slid a photo across to me. It showed my front door frame from the inside with trim removed. Hidden in the wood, deep inside the frame, was a second latch mechanism, concealed behind the molding. It wasn't a standard chain lock or a normal deadbolt. It was something installed for one purpose, to make the door behave as if it were free while still refusing to open. Harris said, "This is why you couldn't get out the front." I stared at the photo until my vision blurred. "He built that," I said. "Yes," Harris replied. "He used it when he needed time." That was the final piece that changed how I remembered everything. The front door didn't jam, it didn't stick, it didn't swell with humidity. It followed a plan. I walked out of that meeting into a normal afternoon where cars passed and people bought groceries and the sky looked ordinary. I stood in the parking lot for a moment and listened to my own breathing, trying to convince my body it could stop bracing for the next sound. The county later sealed the passageways and removed the concealed hardware. They cleared the shed area and dismantled the corridor. They did what officials do after something breaks in a way that scares everyone. They fixed the physical problem. They couldn't fix what stayed in my head, which was simple and sharp. The house had not been haunted. It had been used. And the only reason I'm the one telling you this, instead of being another flyer on a pole, is because my friend walked into that basement and understood the danger 1 second sooner than I did.